This is going to be edited out, I promise. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and boy oh boy, today I am joined by Dr. Josh Rasmussen, and if you don't know who he is, well, you probably should. He's a philosopher from Azusa Pacific University, and he specializes in things like intentionality, propositions, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of religion, things like that. And so, Josh, thank you so much for joining me and coming on my channel.
Thank you. It's a delight to be with you.
Okay, so today we're going to be discussing basically productive and loving dialogue across ideological barriers. The title is basically going to be how to discuss the fundamental nature of reality, with special emphasis on how, right? It's basically insight flow between people who might disagree on fundamental matters regarding, religion, politics, science, things like that. And so it's really special emphasis, maybe not so much on like the specific things over which we disagree, but how we disagree, right? So it's special emphasis on that how. And so I don't know, like Josh, you before we went live, you gave a really good framework for this whole discussion. And so I'm wondering if you could maybe just touch on that a little bit before delving into the topics.
Yeah, so Joe, you were outlining the topics, and I was thinking, well, these are all related by this mutual interest that we have, this goal, this desire, this passion, which is to get more truth seen, visible. And if you think of truth being seen in minds, you see truth in your mind. I see hopefully at least one truth in my own mind, at least some truths. And yet the truths sort of get locked up in people's minds. And in conversations, there's often a barrier for how to get the truth visible. And so this project of figuring out what's true, the process, I think can really help people to become more powerful, to see more truths themselves, and for more truths to become visible for everybody else. And so I really think everything we're going to be talking about is going to be really about that joint project that we have to get more truth. And why do we want truth? Well, if you see more things, you're aligned with more of reality, and I think that makes you more powerful. But also, it's just like intrinsically exciting to see truth, right? I mean, that's the goal. So, yeah.
Yeah. That's what Socrates died for. I mean, that's on the cover of the sorry, that intentionally put his drinking hemlock and so on. So it's all about truth and really trying to get truths from people who we might have initially antagonized or thought that they don't have much truth or they don't have much truth to offer, but really trying to really everyone has deep and profound insights that they can bring to the discussion, even if they disagree with us on so many different matters. They still have their own personal sight by which they see into the fundamental nature of reality, things that we perhaps didn't see. So yeah, I don't know if you had anything to comment on that last bit, but okay.
Yeah, I resonate with that. I mean, just to add to that and to kind of echo that, I mean, I feel like there are all sorts of things that you've helped me see, Joe. I mean, and you would be interacting with my thoughts. And a lot of it is that for every single thought, there's thoughts about the thoughts, right? And so there's this sort of infinite expansion. And so we just need each other. I mean, it's just, I don't know, it can't be overstated. And I think that sometimes we don't see the need that we have for each other's eyes because, this is kind of a theme for me, but it's because we tend to sort of take certain people and put them behind a fence and think, okay, well, these aren't friends or something because they have the wrong beliefs or something like that, right? And then we don't end up getting the insight that they have to help us and to serve us. So yeah, I like how you put that. All right,
Sweet.
continue.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's good. So the first topic basically for the audience, and I'm going to have a sort of outline in the description, so you guys can check that if you want. But the first thing that we're going to try to cover is just like productive and loving dialogue across ideological barriers. So really thinking about people with whom we might vehemently disagree, but how do we get like sort of productive and loving exchange going on between such people, whether it be in real life or on Facebook or what have you. And so that's sort of the first topic that we're going to try to cover. And the first thing under that first topic was basically thinking about insight flow and how do we facilitate this insights spreading across ideological barriers and really actually getting people to listen not only to yourself, but also getting yourself to listen to them and get this insight flow between people. So do you have any initial thoughts on that? I know we're going to get into some of the strategies that I have in my book, but before we get into that, do you have any initial thoughts on insight flow and just things that, to open us up?
Yeah, just one thought. So really just to be aware that in every conversation, there's two layers to the conversation. There's the surface layer of the ideas, like what you're actually talking about. So maybe let's say it's a debate on free will. and maybe you're a compatibilist and your interlocutor is a libertarian. And so you're really trying to figure that out. You're bringing your arguments, they're bringing their arguments. And then just like to realize that there is this other layer in that conversation. I call it a kind of psychological layer. There's the layer of the conversation that makes that specific conversation meaningful beyond just the question about whether you have free will. It's like there's something else going on. It's like you want to be understood. You feel like maybe there are certain things in your perspective, maybe that they're not quite seeing, and you're also curious to understand their perspective. And these desires make up that psychological flow. And I think that a lot of times, I'll just speak for myself as a philosopher, but I think a lot of us as philosophers will get so focused on the level of ideas that we lose sight of that sort of psychological flow. And you might think, and maybe this is sort of how I've thought, which is, why even care about that? I mean, that's psychology. Like, we want truth, we want logic, we want reason. But what I noticed was that we're human beings and that you actually can't divide that. So that in order to have a better flow of understanding on the level of the arguments, it does help a lot to clean up the flow on the level of the psychology. And if you can be in that state of love, that's kind of the most fundamental state. That's sort of a simple state of like a positive desire for the welfare of the other person. That just sets in motion this, to sort of play with the metaphor, the current, the beautiful, peaceful currents of psychology. And then what I've discovered is that more insights then are able to flow back and forth. Like, I just learn a lot more personally than when the waters are all muddied and I'm spending all my energy thinking about how I could just be understood rather than, like actually expanding it's like I'm thinking about myself too much. I'm thinking like, oh, I want them to understand me rather than thinking about the arguments. And that can happen when it's muddy psychological currents. So.
Yeah. I also find so many times in discussions, it's like, you just feel, and maybe oftentimes this is us towards other people as well, but you often feel as though the other person just doesn't even like see you, or like, I don't know, it's not even about like understand. I mean, it is about understanding the argument, but it's like understanding that I'm also just trying to get to the truth, right? I'm like, just try to like see me and just, I don't know, it's difficult to, but it's like this deep need, and that can help not only like the insight flow between me and that person, but I don't know, also spectators watching, and like, I don't know. Do you have anything on that?
Well, Joe, have you ever been sort of accused or labeled as somebody who maybe doesn't care about what's true because you just happen to have a different viewpoint?
Yes.
Right? And it's like I think everybody who engages in idea conversations has that experience. And it's sort of unfortunate because I think what happens is people will circle around a belief or a non-belief, and then they'll associate a set of virtues and values around the belief or around the non-belief. Those get connected. And so then the feeling is that anybody who has a different view on this topic, they must not share those values. They must not. And then you're just in this conversation trying to say, okay, look, in the end, I don't even care that we disagree about this, but I want you to at least see that I share your values. Can you at least see that? And sometimes it's like really tough to even come to that place, I've discovered.
Yeah. And speaking of like tough to get into that place, we can actually bridge into certain tips and strategies to help us at least get into that place, and maybe to help our interlocutors if they can sort of implement these tips. And so hopefully to make it less tough, really to make it easier. So I don't know. I don't really have any. I don't know if I have any favorites, but let's see. How about you pick a number between 1 and 22?
12.
Okay. So tip 12. This is nice. Okay. It says, rid yourself of the game mindset. There are no points to be scored. There is no winning, apart from gaining greater insight, which is collaboration-based, not competition-based. So what do you think about that? Can you help
I'm still thinking you've got 22 tips. That's awesome. I want to hear you. I was like, what is this number 22? Oh, you've got 22 tips to share. Yeah. I'd like to hear all of them, to be honest. Oh, that's great, Joe. I mean, the game mindset, because it sort of leads to competition. I mean, the sort of pushback on that, and we've talked about that, is that the game can create a certain kind of interest, and the interest can get people thinking and digging into things at a level of depth that they just wouldn't otherwise dig into. I mean, like, have you ever looked into an article that's very obscure and you're like reading the the data and the primary source. And it's like, well, why are you actually looking at that? Well, it's because it's connected to a game or something, right? Like some
Yeah.
sort of conversation that's making it energized.
Hmm.
But like you said, I mean, if you're feeling like you have to win, then if you're wrong, it'll be harder to see that you're wrong, because seeing that you're wrong means that you have to admit that you lost.
Yeah.
And
It
that's
frames
the
your whole
problem.
it frames your whole
Yeah.
mindset. Like it frames the entire context of the debate, the discussion, whatever it is. And it taints everything, and it really it harms that insight flow. I mean, it's almost like building up some sort of a dam or something. Um, anyway, if you want to go through the 22, that I'm down
List
with
them.
that.
Can you name them? I'd like to hear them.
Okay, yeah. So for the audience, yeah, okay, I'll just go through. So I'll go through tip number 1. Okay, so it says recognize that we are all biased in favor of our current views. It's time to
Mhm.
stop thinking of that as a personality flaw. It's instead a flaw of human nature. And being open-minded is really hard, and we should appreciate that. I mean, we should work to mitigate such bias, yes, but don't degrade or look down on others who suffer from it. Right, so that's the first tip, and maybe you can pick out some of later when we get through all
Mhm.
22 that resonated most with you. So the second one is just to emphasize agreement, right? So too often we get bogged down in our disagreements, just failing to see miles upon miles of common ground between you and your interlocutor. So emphasizing agreement. Tip number 3 is to explicitly recognize that you and your dialectical partners are just on the same team with the same goals, right? Gaining a greater understanding of an issue and discovering treasures of truth, right? It's a mutual effort, and we're on the same path towards a common destination. Explorers on a journey. So that's the third tip. The fourth tip is be willing to learn from your dialectical partner. Everyone has unique experiences, perspectives, and worldviews from which we can gain value and insights. Don't go into the conversation with the sole aim of trying to convert or convince them. Right? That one resonates so much with me, just because a lot of the experience that I've had with I don't know, just people that they're only talking to you just to try to get you to their viewpoint. It's just like no.
Yeah,
But
if
that
your
one.
goal is to expand understanding, and I think that's the complex part here, is that there are many goals to have. And that's why I think it's helpful to think of all of this as sort of tips and strategies to maximize sight for yourself and for others. Yeah. Continue. Sorry.
Sweet. No, no, it's all good. Okay, so tip number 5 is say I don't know when you genuinely don't know. There is beauty in admitting that further paths of discovery and treasure await you. So that's the 5th tip. The 6th tip is curb certainty. It's okay, indeed good, to be certain on some positions, but it should perhaps be somewhat rare. Certainty can bleed into dogmatism, and that is to be avoided. Recognize that you might be wrong, right? And that's I don't know, just look yourself in the mirror and just be like, I might be wrong, and just face the fact. It might be difficult, but yeah. So then tip number 7 is we can't rid our biases because, they're sort of built into our human nature, but we can modify dialectical contexts to mitigate them. So like create a welcoming, respectful environment where truth and love are center stage. Um, and then tip number 8 is perspective take, right? So think about the life experiences of your dialectical partner and place yourself in his or her shoes. This helps to humanize them rather than dehumanize them. And that really gets back to this sort of caricaturizing. It's almost as though we take people in a group, we construct a caricature of that group, and whenever we meet someone who we qualify as falling under that group, we automatically attach this caricature to them, and then we judge what they're saying in light of that caricature. It's like seeing through the rosy glasses that you yourself constructed, and now you're man. Anyway,
Mhm.
then tip number 9 is oh wow. Tip number 9 is ditch the caricatures. Wow, we are individuals with loves, passions, desires, and value. No one fits a predefined caricature or stereotype. We have our unique quirks and flaws and skills. Consciously try to break pre-existent caricatures of the type of person with whom you're speaking.
Mhm.
So that's tip number 9. Tip number 10 is immersion. Immerse yourself on a daily basis in non-echo chamber contexts. Make friends with people with different backgrounds, worldviews, life experiences. Listen to a variety of podcasts or watch a variety of videos, and so on. Yeah, I mean that one kind of hits close to home because I know some people that are very close to me that like all they do is listen to this one podcast, this one viewpoint, and they're always like digging on
Mhm.
other anyway. But and that's not to say like I'm immune to this. Like I obviously suffer every single day from all these tips failing every single one of these tips. So I think we should all just
If
try
if
our
I
hardest.
may if I may insert something here. So I think this can also be related to the different goals and the different values and even just things that people are kind of after. And I feel like one of the things that that you're after, Joe, is you are after an understanding that allows you to be a leader in the world of ideas. And it's not that you're after being a leader. What I'm trying to say is you're after understanding, and that firsthand understanding positions you to be a leader. Because I've been thinking a lot about this, and I would even get bothered when I would see certain people who would it's almost like their minds would be chained to somebody else's mind, if that makes sense. It's almost like they're not taking responsibility to sort of think it through or to understand or to check the different. It's like somebody else sort of thinking for them. And on one level, it would sort of bother me, but then on another level, I would think, well, there are all sorts of areas where I let other people take care of that. Like, I'm not going to figure out my plumbing, or I'm not going to, I'll just let them take care of that. And almost like to realize that there's nothing sort of wrong with certain people being followers and other people being leaders. At least that's something that's kind of been helpful for me, just to almost like recognize that, and just to realize that it's almost like it takes a certain amount of work to be in the position of being a leader and having like firsthand understanding. And that's where all of those tips, I would say, are essential. It's like those are the tips that make you very powerful as a leader. And then what you find as a leader, this is what I found, is that then there will be people who will see you as a leader, and then some people will become followers of your work, right? And then it's almost like, well, you don't want that either. You don't want them to follow anybody, right? You want them to, well, they can follow reason, the majesty of reason. That can be their leader, right? That there's only one leader you should have. It's the majesty of reason. It's the light of reason. That should be your leader.
It's the leader of all leaders. Yeah.
That's right.
Oh, man. I love it. Okay. No, that was just that was so wonderful. Okay.
And just by the way, all these tips they are in your book, right? That's the case. Yeah. So I want your audience to know that you can get these tips in the book. So
okay. Oh man. Okay, so we just went over immersion. That was tip number 10. Tip number 11 is explore, don't expose. Use the tools of reason, universal experience, and genuine love and respect to explore the issues rather than expose flaws, cracks, or internal inconsistencies in your dialectical partner's beliefs. Tip number 12 is rid yourself. That was the one. Rid yourself of the game mindset, right? There are no points to be scored. There's no winning apart from greater insight, which is collaboration based, not competition based. So that was number 12. I do think that one might actually be my favorite out of all of them, but we'll keep going. Tip number 13 is modify your language. This one really gets me frustrated, and we'll talk about frustration as a motivation later on in this video, so people stay tuned for that. But tip number 13 is modify your language. The words we use influence the ways we think and feel and view those who disagree with us. This is subtle but massively important, right? For example, at least try to use discussion more than you use debate. Right. I feel like I'm like PETA here, who's saying like, feed two birds with one scone instead of kill two birds with one stone. No. But no, it is true that the words we use influence the way we think about others. And, we think about debates and dialectical context, how we think and feel. It kind of goes back to that caricaturing thing. But so another example, so I use the discussion versus debate example. Another example I use is use here is something to consider, not here's why you're wrong, right? When we're in discussion, because that other one just almost, it's like it closes off the debate. Like psychologically speaking, the other person is going to be closed off when they hear here's why you're wrong, right? Just say here's something to consider, like have you considered this? I don't know, just modifying our language, like, and if you're going to use like demonstration or proof, those have their contexts, when they're good and useful. But I don't know, maybe consider like argument or something along those lines. What do you think about that?
Here's how I'm thinking of it will work. Or my thought is this. Because then it's sort of the I language can help a lot. Yeah.
Okay, tip number 14 is take a virtue-based approach. Ask yourself, am I cultivating the intellectual and moral virtues? Am I displaying the requisite intellectual humility? Your primary aim needs to be twofold. First, aim for truth, and second, aim for loving each other. Virtue is all about aiming, right? Intellectual virtue is fundamentally aiming at truth, while moral virtue is fundamentally aiming at goodness. So yeah, just focus on your aims and try to orient yourself either, well, not either, but both towards truth and goodness. And the goodness is sort of loving your dialectical partner. Yeah, so that's tip number 14. Tip number 15 is try not to sew your worldview or position into the very fabric of your own being, right? Your value is not tied to the positions you take. If you can, at least temporarily, separate yourself from the position you take, arguments against that position won't be seen or felt as personal attacks. So that's tip number 15. Tip number 16 is listen, be fully present, right? Put away distractions, but also put away your preconceived ideas about what the other person holds, believes, thinks, etc. Right? In order to grasp their position correctly, you need to listen to them, not your pre-existing conception of them, right? This includes defining terms at the beginning of the discussion, asking them what they mean by the terms, right? Without defining the terms, for instance, you only listen to your own preconceived notions and not your dialectical partner's understanding of the issue, and so on. So it looks like I have 2 paragraphs here. If the occasion is right, restate the point made by your dialectical partner. This shows that you're genuinely listening to them, which sort of de-escalates our tribalistic tendencies. Also, be sure to ask respectfully, is this what you mean, right? So instead of assuming what they mean, you can always just ask, like, well, hey, I mean, is this what you mean before I start arguing against a caricature? Is this truly what you're saying? That's tip number 16. Tip number 17 is it's all right, in fact, preferable to go slowly, right? Philosophy and truth-seeking in general is best done slowly, right? That's what Thomas Bogardus, who's been on Capturing Christianity, that's what he emphasizes, like philosophy is best done slowly. Clever gotcha type remarks only alienate your dialectical partner. It's better to avoid such gotcha phrases. And that ties back to the game mindset, right? All these things are intertwined, and really it is about truth and insight flow that you were saying at the beginning. So that's tip number, what was it? 17? Yeah, 17. Tip number 18 is, this is a hard one, steel man, don't straw man. You would be surprised at how much it reduces tension and tribalism within discussions when you take your dialectical partner's argument and improve upon it. So I don't know, like it feels so good. It's like not only do they understand you, but they're like trying to help you, trying to help your case and construct it better. It shows not only an understanding of the other position, but that's how you display your like utmost love. It's like, I want you to see even further into this issue. So you're constructing their case, you're helping build up their case, and not like, oh, I can do this even better than you do. Like, no, not like that, but like genuinely helping them. Man, I like that one too. Tip number 19 is use the principle of charity. When there are 2 ways to interpret something your dialectical partner said, focus on the one with greater plausibility or justification. So that's just a general guiding philosophical principle. Tip number 20 is, well, this one's from, I think, Michelle Obama. When they go low, go high. So don't stoop to levels of ridicule, insult, and tribalism. Maintain civility and respect. That can be very difficult. If it's appropriate, simply just respectfully end the conversation or walk away, or like close the laptop if you're on Facebook. Okay, so that's number 20. We're almost near the end. I hope these are helping people in the audience. I do. Tip number 21 is, oh, I like this one. Avoid psychologizing. Too often we spot potential psychological roots in others, while failing to see the psychological roots of our own beliefs and worldviews, right? Psychological influences on our beliefs are inescapable, right? It's part of the human condition. Focus instead, as much as you can, on reasons, not psychological origins of those reasons. And then tip number 22, the last one, is that arguments, well, this one's from Josh, arguments are not weapons and are rarely knocked down. Recognize room for rational disagreement. Use arguments as tools to probe the nature of reality. They're like illuminating flashlights. They don't force or compel agreement. They invite collective exploration. So it's that distinction between forcing and compelling versus inviting, and more like a collaboration-based versus competition-based. And again, like these are all positive like feedbacks. Like you can only do this sort of illuminating a flashlight and don't force or compel agreement if you like don't use those phrases like this positively, decisively demonstrates with deductive certitude that you're incorrect. You know, like the language that we use. Like I don't know. This all feeds back into each other. Each one of these tips feeds back into the 21 other tips, which is just so powerful. So what do you think about some of those, or like maybe some of your favorites or something? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I was totally with you on all of that. I mean, and what you said at the end, how they all sort of feed back on each other. That one about the game mindset does relate to all of them because it's about the goal. So like if your goal is to conquer and to win, then it's rhetorically effective to psychologize, to say it's certain that, to, in an email correspondence that we had, we were talking about the difference between sort of expressing your viewpoint as your viewpoint versus objectifying your viewpoint as sort of an objective standard. So instead of saying, it looks to me that the Pythagorean theorem is true, you just say, well, it is the case that reason reveals the Pythagorean theorem is true. It's like, okay, well, what about those who are, they question that parallel postulate. So they're not sure, if all the if all the premises are true, right? It's like, are we saying that they're not rational, right? Well, if we're in a game mindset, yeah, we want to say that because that's how we're going to win. And so, I mean, it's almost like I want to say, like, if you do want to win, then you can reverse a lot of those tips and like do the opposite, because that can like actually help you win. And I've seen this. I've seen people come away winning. At least in the short term, you can win that war. But if your goal is actually to get more understanding, you really want that. And that's the cool thing, Joe. Like every time that I hear you talk about philosophy, I see and feel your passion to understand. Like that's where your mind's like, oh yes, this feels good. Like things are clicking, like you're understanding, right? And I think that if that's what people want, if they really want to understand those tips, and I was going to ask you actually how you came up with those, like where you discovered all those tips, but those things will really make you powerful to understand. But yeah, I'm curious, like, so how did you generate all of that?
Oh man, well the long story short is it was back in, I think, what was it, March or something? It was like early March, and you made a post. I forget what post it was, but it was one of your Facebook posts. Of course, it's a usual Josh standard, like amazing post.
Like not being tribal or something like this.
Yeah, probably. It was something like that. And I was
yeah,
just like,
and you commented below.
I commented below, and
That's
then I was that was like me, I was just going crazy, like that little cat GIF or GIF, however people are gonna kill me for pronouncing it. The cat is just typing away. I was just typing away because I was so excited. I was like, man, like Josh, you're causing almost so many ideas for these tips, and so I wrote them down.
And then I caused the ideas. Those I caused the occasion for you to get excited, and then you shared those ideas. Yeah, I thought that was interesting. Yeah, keep going.
And then I refined those a little bit, and then put them into my own sort of post on Facebook with a little image. I take that little image thing from you because it sort of catches your eye, and then you're drawn to it. So so I refined them, put them in that post, and then and then I was just like, you know what, I'm gonna put these in the first chapter, and so then I refined them further and then put them into there, and I ended up having 22. It wasn't really like a magic number; it was just what ultimately came out as, So.
Yeah, and I think those come from your experience in conversations. I mean, and I think that's how it is for me too. It's just like in having conversations, I start paying attention to like what's working, what's not working, and and I saw your comment there. I thought that's awesome, and I was just like that should be like published or something like this, and then it showed up, it got published in your book. So
yeah. Oh, and
cool.
I did want to say like I mean, a lot of them were. Like these things are just like accretions from years upon years of like dialogue on like Instagram and Facebook, and talking with people and talking in like reading groups and debating people at the lunch table, and just so many different things like that are really compiling together and forming all these, and like reading like actual psychological studies. So some of these are actually some of these are based on like peer-reviewed research. I went through some like psychological stuff that are like actually things like on tribalism. I know what is his name? Joshua Green's, I think, he has a book called Moral Tribes or something. It's an excellent book. It's also an Audible, so people who like to listen when they're doing like laundry or something. But but it's such a good book, and he goes through like the psychology of tribalism and like alienating, and he talks about different strategies, and so you'll see some overlap here and there with that. But so a lot of it's research based, a lot of it is my own experience. But yeah,
you mentioned the perspective taking would be something.
Yeah,
that's sort of a buzz term. My sister, she's a therapist, so she does work in psychology, and that's a word she uses a lot. Taking somebody's perspective.
Yeah, that one is heavy in the literature. Yeah, so that tip was definitely based on that. So so the last thing in this first topic that we're going to cover is strategies for de-escalation. Now, unfortunately, I didn't include 22 tips for de-escalation, but maybe we can just. Okay, so what do I mean by de-escalation? So oftentimes when we're in discussions, whether on Facebook or in real life, it gets heated, and maybe it starts with one of your own remarks or their remarks. Maybe it's some kind of insult. Maybe it's just using colorful adjectives, like instead of just saying incorrect, blatantly incorrect or something like that, or like patently false, as opposed to false or something. I'm kind of a sometimes when I get very mad, those are the colorful words that I use. I use like blatantly and patently and oh man. Anyway, so strategies for de-escalation. So that's what escalation is. The conflict just gets worse and worse until you're battling, you're butting heads. And so how do we try to get us back down, right? Get us back down to the issues and back down to love and back down to respect when we've already gone past the tipping point, as it were. So what are some of your first thoughts on that?
Well, I was just thinking, my first thought, I was just thinking about you would use memes sometimes. And I don't know if this is a de-escalation strategy, but you and
Sometimes.
Micah, you guys would get into this funny little exchange, and it would be sort of removed from the sort of philosophy of religion stuff, at like maybe political stuff. And then you would just have like these hilarious memes. And I always just think it's great because it sort of, I don't know, kind of brings spice to the conversation or whatever.
Mhm.
But I don't know. I mean, like, is this a de-escalation move? It's just totally out of fun. Like, tell me more about this.
That's so. Oh man. Okay. It's a double-edged sword. It is 100% a double-edged sword. So sometimes, we have to distinguish in the culture of internet stuff, as the kids say, we have to distinguish between memes and GIFs or GIFs, and sometimes they overlap. But like the GIFs oftentimes are just like you put like a funny face, it's someone who's like blinking twice. I mean, like people know what I'm talking about, but or like the cat that's typing really fast, or like the socialism means free ice cream one. But yeah, so those are the GIFs, and those are usually, I don't know, those are trying to help de-escalation usually, but they can actually hurt. So that's why it's a double-edged sword. But the memes, it's also a double-edged sword with the memes. So there are like these good faith meme wars that are going on, between like classical theists and non-classical theists, or like neoclassical theists and so on. And sometimes those can actually fuel tribalism. And if you're in a discussion on something and you're disagreeing with someone and you put like a meme in there when, it's not sort of like a pre-existent context wherein both parties are sort of already knowing that the input of a meme would be in good faith. If that's not like sort of a pre-established, I don't know, it's almost like an intuitive sort of knowledge that you have, like a sort of social convention, as it were. But if that's not pre-established and then you put in the meme, that's going to be tribalistic. That's gonna escalate things. It's gonna get people angry. They're gonna object to the meme. They're gonna think you're making fun of them. Other times though, memes are really good de-escalation tactics, and they get people to laugh, and they're just like, hey, listen, we're just poking fun, we're just messing with each other. And especially with Micah, because I make fun of him for being a socialist, but anyway. And not that that's bad, but I make fun of it making fun,
It's in good fun. It is in good fun. And that's what I always see when you're doing that. I always feel like it actually does lighten it and just kind of makes it fun and just, yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, and like intentional exaggeration. So people are like, socialism killed 100 million. I'm just like, well, ignoring like the ludicrousys of that claim that like an idea can kill people. But like, when you'd be talking about pillows, I'd be like, well, did you know last year socialism killed 40 billion pillows? It's just like, and Mike and I, we have this sort of understanding. So it depends on context. Anyway,
well, my wife and I will do this sometimes. I mean, we've been in conversations where, we'll kind of exaggerate something, not to like hurt each other, but to make it funny, and it does kind of relieve tension, and so that can be helpful. But yeah, as far as de-escalation, I mean, I think a lot again comes down to your goal, because I feel like tension arises when people are a little bit at cross purposes, to be honest. When philosophers are getting together and we really are just seeking to understand something, the phenomenon that I'm sort of accustomed to is we're sort of sitting at a table and there's some sort of ideas that are out on the table, and now we're kind of working together in this sort of construction. And there can be a little bit of a competition of like, let's try to break it and then rebuild, and maybe a little bit of seeking significance. Like if I can break this professor's system, I get points because, it sort of contributes to that feeling of like, wow, I'm powerful enough to break their system. Mm-hmm. But generally, like if people are really seeking to have an understanding, I don't know, like it seems like that feeling of tension, it's almost like it doesn't even have the fuel to grow. And I feel like I'm actually just kind of externally processing this with you right now. I'm just kind of thinking about this, because thinking like what actually causes the escalation in the first place, and it's like, well, if things are escalated, of course there are things you can do to de-escalate. You can be humble and sort of kind of step back from the issue a little bit and maybe affirm the person or see what's good in what they're saying. seek common ground, seek clarity. But if the purposes are still cross-purpose and there isn't both sides really trying to understand, it's almost like, well, then you're at cross purposes. You're not trying to get the same. I mean, I feel like in any conversation, there has to be at least some purpose that's the same. And I'll tell you, I've liberated myself from conversations once I finally realized, oh, we don't have the same goal in this conversation. And that's okay. It's not that I need them to have my goal. It's just like I realize, oh, okay, we're at cross purposes. So this conversation isn't going to help them. It's not going to help me. So I don't even need to try to de-escalate that. I just leave. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that was actually one of the tips. Well, I guess I just realized that one of the tips is maybe for de-escalation, right? It was just like respectfully walk away at the end of one of the tips.
Yeah.
That was one. There's always, well, I don't know. Maybe it depends on your psychology and like whether you have certain like anxiety leanings, like, you know, but I don't know. Sometimes walking away, it's difficult. It's difficult for me because I'm just like, no, they still said something I need to respond to. It's just like that claim was not correct, and I need to. It's like I don't know. It's like I almost want. It's not. It's almost as though it's like I want other people to help see that that's not the end of the debate. Because sometimes when people watch like a comment discuss, they watch a comment dialogue or something, and there's a last remark, and then the other person kind of just walks away, or you know it fizzles out, and they sort of automatically think, oh well, he must not have had a good response, or like he's just quitting or something. Or you know, like these other guys must have won because they got in the last word or something like that. I don't know, and so that's why it's almost like it's just like feedback loop. It's like you want to keep on going and keep on going, and I don't know.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I understand that exactly. Yeah,
and it also goes back to our aims, right? I mean, if we are still kind of stuck in that winning mindset, then we fear that we lost, right? We fear that by them saying something last, they have won, and we're going to sort of fear for our reputation. We're going to fear that other people will think that we lost, and other people think that that person won. But if we try to shift the mindset, I mean, that'll help to mitigate that at least somewhat. But I don't know. It's difficult when
if your goal isn't to win, then then it's fine. If everybody thought you lost, that's fine. That wasn't your goal anyway.
Yeah, that's
true. But
it's
difficult if you. I know you've been in conversations. I've seen some of these where you definitely had an understanding of their perspective from what you were saying and from everything I know about you. And it was evident that they didn't have an understanding of your perspective. So you're holding your perspective and their perspective. And like in that case, it can be very difficult if you have both perspectives in your own mind. And you've even steel-manned their perspective. So you've even been able to build their perspective out, maybe even better than they would themselves, right? And then if in that context, your interlocutor sort of goes away thinking they just know more than you, that's just, how can you just let that sit, you know?
I know. It's just like you feel this compulsion. I don't know, man. And there's so many like different psychological leanings, and man, and this is proving your initial claim at the outset of this that you can't separate these aspects of the human person, right? I mean, it's just like this reason-based and the psychology-based and the person-based aspect that you can't separate them. And this is the very fact that what you and I are ranting about right now, that is illustrating that, right?
And I think just being aware of it does make you more powerful. I mean, we're talking about like Facebook exchanges, but this shows up in article exchanges, in books, peer-reviewed articles, sophisticated books. And it's like, well, there's an energy behind that book that's more than just the arguments. There's also the psychological layer to that. And I've actually found that even in getting articles published, getting them through the peer review process, the thing that's great about the peer review process is that it does select for these virtues and tips that you're talking about, because if you don't do those things, then you're less likely to get your article through the peer review process. Yeah. And I used to think, it bothered me before, because I thought, oh, well, all that really matters is the pristine argument. It doesn't matter like how you present it. But then what I actually realized is that by paying attention to the psychology, it actually helps me to see and think about the value and to highlight the value and to figure out ways of developing the argument so it's actually better. Because I know that the person on the other side of the peer review I'm going to assume that they're going to disagree with the conclusion. And so I want to write it in such a way that even while they disagree with the conclusion, they're excited by the argument. They like it. There's a happy feeling, right? And so the psychological element does, if you're aware of it, does make you more powerful in your ability to analyze the arguments and to bring your arguments into the marketplace for people to see their value. And what I feel like this has kind of been a learning experience for me in the last few years is just like realizing that, because I think a lot of times what philosophers will do is we will actually not be really fully aware of the kind of the psychological or sort of emotional layer of things, or the person layer, because we are so fascinated by ideas. And it's actually taken work for me to actually pay attention to that. When I was dating my wife, Rachel, for the first year, this is before we were married, we were hanging out, and there were certain times when there was something that like hurt my feelings about something, but it was like too small, and it hurt my feelings in a way that I didn't understand. I wasn't self-aware enough. Mm-hmm. Whereas it seemed like Rachel was actually very good at knowing what she was feeling. And so she would articulate it like right away, and then it would get cleansed, it would get sort of cleaned out of the system. So there was this episode, it was like maybe 6 months into dating, when I was hanging out with her and we started talking about something. And then all of a sudden I just like got choked up and I started crying. And you have to understand, like my kids have like never seen me cry. I don't know what it is. Like I just like don't cry or whatever. It's not that I don't feel emotions.
I'm kind of the same, but go
on. I don't
on.
know what it is. I just don't cry. And I didn't just start crying. Like I started bawling. I was just like bawling. And my Rachel, she's got really curious, like what's going on. and then we were like talking, and I was able to articulate kind of like a whole set of like things, and I don't even remember what they were, but it was just like I wasn't aware enough of them. And then once they all got out, and she could understand that and then connect with that and then appreciate that and see me, really see me. I think that's what it was, is there was some part of me that I felt wasn't being seen. Then that will lead to obviously a better relationship. But my point is that like it actually takes work to be aware of what's going on. And if you're in a Facebook conversation and you want to come back to that, you can like ask yourself, why do I want to come back? Like what's my need? What do I hope to get out of this? And sometimes just asking that question helped me to be more aware of even like what I want out of the conversation, which then tends to make the conversation go better, so that truth can be seen and more insights can flow.
Yeah, just taking a step back and just reflecting on really what's motivating you. I mean, I really resonate with that thing. It's just like, it's almost like just being understood. It's like I need you just to at least to just hold my view. Just, I don't know, just like hold it and just recognize it, please. Just that, I don't know, that sort of thing. It's like the distinction between like, I don't know, throwing a dart and like it just bouncing off the wall completely. It's like you don't feel like you're understood, and that can also harm insight flow, versus throwing the dart and it's actually sticking and they're like really sort of absorbing it and just understanding, and like they're hearing you, they're listening to you. I
think sometimes what happens, the reason why people get entangled sometimes is that they're trying to be understood, but their method of trying to be understood ends up making the other person feel like their view is minimized. And so then the other person comes back and feels like, well, their view is not really on the table. So then they come back and minimize, and it just goes back and forth like this infinite chain. And I think that's kind of really what's going on. And I've noticed this too. Like there's this one conversation I was having with a colleague. It was on some political topic, and I felt very animated. Like I was like thinking about, okay, I want to come back and really explain some of these things. And so one random day he just looked at me. He's like, Josh, like, he said something about like, that showed me that he understood me and appreciated like my understanding. And then after he said all that, he said, yeah, and I'm actually curious to hear more. I noticed in that conversation was the funniest thing. I discovered that my motivation to share more like evaporated. And then I was like, oh, okay, well, it looks like my motivation there was to be understood and maybe even appreciated. And once that was met, it's like, okay, well, it wasn't even about necessarily that particular topic. It was just about being understood. So I feel like that's kind of a baseline. And if people can feel understood in the conversations and spend time seeking an understanding of each other, it does create the foundation for then a more productive conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And that's actually a nice sort of natural bridge into like the nature of rational disagreement, right? So we're talking about understanding people who disagree with us. And part of that is just recognizing room for rational disagreement. And so this is sort of the second topic that we wanted to get in. And so I guess one thing that's interesting along these lines is like maybe a conception of arguments as sort of knockdown like just things in their own right that are just like, this is the argument, it's like premise by premise, and like this is the knockdown, like compelling belief and so on, versus like seeing arguments almost as like confessions. To give the audience like maybe a better understanding of what I'm getting at here, a confession is basically you're just saying like, look, like, listen, I simply confess to you that P, for instance, seems obviously true to me and defensible for my lights, right? It's like I'm not even. Sometimes it's like you're not even trying to convince the other person per se. It's like I just want to share to you my sight, like what it seems to me, just to be obvious or defensible and so on. So it's like I'm just reporting how things are striking me. It's like all I can do is just confess to you that this is how things seem to me, and like I mean I can spell out the justifications and so on, but I mean ultimately those two will probably come down to like confessions of personal sight. So like I just confess that this particular argument strikes me as sound. And I don't know, that might help to, I don't know, even reduce some tribalism, because you're not presenting it as a sort of like, you have to believe this. This is like the only rational, conclusion. Like, what do you think about the sort of arguments as confessions?
Yeah, no, I mean, that resonates with me. And I actually think this is a point that will be sort of controversial. Perhaps some of your viewers won't agree with this, and that's okay, but because it does turn on your epistemology of justification. And what I've noticed, it's actually kind of interesting because in the philosophical terrain, the views roughly get divided into three views. There's the reliabilism, a proper functionalism, and an evidentialism. And then there's this sort of internalism, externalism debate. But what I've actually noticed is that in the sort of popular discourse, it seems like maybe a more relevant dividing line is between what you're saying, Joe, about seeing your justification as sort of a perspectival, like confession versus a kind of objective, sort of written in the sky reality. So, like, for example, you might say it seems clear to me that such and such, or you might say it's clear that such and such. Okay, you might say this is absurd, right? Or you might say this strikes my mind as absurd. And these are examples that sort of illustrate the divide. And so I guess I'll just come out and like, I don't think anything is just objectively absurd. I don't think anything is objectively clear. I think absurdity and clarity are relative to epistemic states or minds. And so something can be very clear to me and not clear to somebody else, and very reasonably so, not clear to somebody else. And something can be not clear to me. I mean, a lot of times it's like, okay, help me see something, like help me see what you're seeing. And if they say, no, this is just clear, it's objectively clear, and I don't actually see it. This happens sometimes. I mean, there's many contexts for this, but for whatever reason, right now I'm thinking about in the more of a religious sphere when somebody will say, well, the Bible clearly says such and such.
Yeah.
And there's this feeling like that the clarity there is objective. And it's like, well, I'm not lying. Like, I'm not making up the fact that it's not clear to me. And the feeling is that no, like it should be clear. Like it ought to be clear because it is clear. You know what I mean? Like the text just is clear, So now there's a psychoanalysis of why it's not clear to me. Well, if it's not clear to you, like, have you not looked at the text? Have you not studied the scholars on it? Like, it's like, well, what if I've actually looked at the text? What if I just happen to have a different total set of experiences, even experiences that affect my translation of words, what those words mean. I have to just like tell you this because it illustrates how you can be in rapport with somebody and still use a word differently, and you don't know that you're using it differently. So my wife and I, this is after we were married, this was like a year ago, not even that long ago. And we were having a sort of a tension conversation where I hurt her feelings, and then her communication about that hurt my feelings. And why would I be hurt about that? Well, it's because it all had to do with the word mean. So she thought I was being mean, and I didn't think I was being mean. And so we talked for like 3 hours, like deep into the night, about why we couldn't figure, and you know what the solution was? Her meaning of the word being mean was an externalist meaning. It had to do with how she felt. And my meaning of the word being mean was internalist, had to do with my intention. So I felt like she was denying the reality of my intention. She was actually denying my perspective by saying, oh, you didn't have that intention. And so by me saying, no, I wasn't being mean, I was just trying to say that wasn't my intention. Whereas my effort was actually causing her to feel like I wasn't trusting that actually she was hurt. I was
Yeah.
basically like saying you weren't hurt.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And so it was like, it was so satisfying, like, even like philosophically, because we got into philosophy mode and we're like analyzing it, we figured it out and then we went to sleep. And we talk about that conversation oftentimes because it illustrates that there was just a single word that we just had a different meaning in that word. And that meaning was just filled by a lifetime of experiences. And it was so hard to even figure out that disconnect. And so in the case of like the biblical text or really any texts, anybody who looks at anything, it's going to be looking at it through the lens of their total life experiences.
Yeah.
And so it's going to seem clear to somebody, but it doesn't mean it's clear to somebody else. And I'm thinking about the atheist-theist debates. I've seen this too, where there's a certain characterization of like, so it's clear that, now I'm going to take it from sort of a skeptical point of view. It's like, well, it's clear that there isn't sort of like clear evidence for God. In fact, it's maybe even clear that there isn't any evidence for God. So therefore, if somebody believes in God, well, that is objectively clear. So if they believe in God, it must be because of psychological reasons. Maybe they have a desire, maybe they're under some kind of authority, something like this. So we can psychologize the believer. And then on the other hand, there are believers like where from their total set of experiences, like, well, it actually just seems clear that God is real. And then their temptation would be to psychologize on the other side and say, oh, well,
Yeah.
it's objectively clear. So therefore, if you don't believe, therefore you're ignorant or willfully ignorant or you're not paying sufficient attention or whatever it is. And I just think both of those are just very unhelpful and mistaken because it's not objectively clear and it's not objectively not clear.
Yeah.
Clarity is not an objective notion.
Hmm.
Yeah.
No, yeah, I don't know. That just it resonates so much. And man, it's like I wish I could almost like transplant my experiences into someone else's mind to help them see why what you're
Yes.
saying, why, well, not only why like I might find this other view plausible or something, but
Okay.
I almost want them to like see why I also found what you said perfectly. I don't know. It just seems obviously
Mhm.
true to my mind. Like, I don't know. It
Yeah.
just seems, given my experience, given what I've been through, given what you and I have talked about in our email exchanges,
Yes.
it seems clear to me, to my mind, that there is no such thing as this sort of like objective clarity demonstration thing like that. And it's like it's almost like an incommunicable thing. It's like I can try to tell you and I can try to help you illustrate like. Or I can try to help illustrate, like, okay, there's this thing called the epistemological landscape. We all occupy different positions on that epistemological
Mm-hmm.
landscape. Our position on that is dictated by our past experiences and by
Mm-hmm.
our priors, by what we find plausible, by our intuitive seemings, by our
Yeah.
intuitions, and these are going to vary from person to person because we all have different experiences. We all read different material. I don't know. It's just,
Yeah.
like this clarity, this justification that you're saying. It's going to be based on your position in the epistemological landscape, and that's fine. That's good. And there are going to be different people on different positions of the epistemological landscape, and that's going to influence how they interpret the same argument or the same piece of evidence. And I don't know. It's almost like there's no like objective. I mean, obviously there is like objective truth. There is justification for beliefs. There's an objective fact of the matter as to whether or not someone knows something. We're not going into some sort of relativism. We're talking about
Oh,
the justification. We're talking about rationality. We're talking about epistemic
yes.
notions, right?
Yes.
So it's not as though Josh and I are like these extreme relativists. No, it's actually preserving objectivism and preserving truth that we're compelled in our own minds to adopt this position. It seems clear to our own minds that it is an objective reality, that it is a subjective reality. What is
Epistemic
just
subjectivity.
yeah,
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 it's
epistemic
objectively true.
subjectivity.
Like, yeah, so if people in your audience are disagreeing with this, they're thinking, no, the epistemic features are actually sort of objective and written in the sky. If they're thinking that, they're wrong. They're objectively wrong, but they're probably perfectly rational to think that. I mean,
Exactly,
from their own point, from their
exactly.
own sight, it totally makes sense. They're very reasonable in their perspective. And yeah, I feel like that's just really important because it's people who see. Individuals have eyes.
Yes.
It almost seems axiomatic, like when you point that out. But I've been actually pondering like maybe why we would get a different impression. And I'm thinking it
Mhm.
might have to do even with our educational system. So the way that we would learn things is we would learn things as children out of a textbook. And the textbooks would use third person language. So think of like a
Yeah.
history book. So the history book just says, here are the facts. Like this happened on this date. They don't say how they came to that. They don't say,
Yeah.
well, they certainly don't say, well, it seems to me that the best explanation of the historical documents and the artifacts that I've encountered is that this happened, at this date, right? They don't say any of that. And so you have no training or even awareness about like how to search or how to seek, how to get
Yeah.
to truth. All you have in the beginning is just authorities telling you third person information
Yeah.
and then labeling it fact or proven or established, right? And so then it feels like, well, that's just written in the sky. It's a fact. It's proven. It's established. And you don't understand that, well, in order for something to be proven, it has to be seen by a person. And then the proof is just somebody trying to communicate what they're seeing. That's all it is. And every single proof, and this is also something that is controversial, but this is my experience, which is that every single proof that anybody comes up with, I can always find somebody who is aware of the premises and has reason to doubt one or more of the premises. And you know the show because it's like we have people in our field who would say, well, law of non-contradiction, nah, there's exceptions to that, right? Modus ponens, it's like, no, there's problems actually with that, taking that as a strict inference. It's like every single thing, can be sort of challenged. And somebody might say, well, if everything can be challenged, that means nothing can be known. No, it's the opposite. The whole point is that knowledge isn't a consensus of unchallengeable third-person information. Knowledge is a sort of personal sight. So you can know things. It's just that I think you'll actually end up knowing less if you limit your knowledge to what has been sort of deemed established according to the authorities.
Yeah, yeah, and man, yeah. Like I said, it's almost as though like I want to I also want to be able to have other people's experiences transplanted into my experiences, so I can like see where they're coming from, and I want to transplant my whole I wish we could take our position on the epistemological landscape, this vast landscape, and this vast grand story that we're all a part of, and we. I don't know. It's like a patchwork principle. It's like David Lewis. Like I can patch mine. I can put it on yours, and I can take yours and just patch it into mine. So I can just see things from your perspective. Like I have the same like intuitive, seemings. I have the same priors. I have the same, evidences and the same, reading lists and like experiences, conversations, and so on. I don't know. I wish we could do this patchwork principle, the epistemological patchwork principle. That sounds like
maybe technology. Yeah, that's right. Maybe technology will allow this. We'll like hook up our minds to electrical devices that will allow us to have this perfect sight of everybody else's experience or something like this. But then there's privacy problems, I guess. But
okay.
But what you're saying, and I know we got to move on, but just to conclude it, what you're saying here is that it feels really helpful to understand the different perspectives rather than just objectify one perspective as the standard that rules over all the others. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And if you can just sort of own that you have a perspective and you have almost like the ultimate authority on your perspective and nobody else does, you're the king of your perspective. That's going to really help you a lot. And not sort of think that somebody else has the authority or that you have the authority over other people's perspectives.
Yeah, and that really bridges nicely into the next thing that I wanted to cover, which was like the frustration as a motivation and guide or at least as partly a motivator and a guide when we're talking about philosophy and disagreements and politics and what have you. So, I mean, you were just talking about objectifying sight, right? So we've been arguing that sight is this sort of subjective thing. It's based on persons. It's based on your epistemological landscape, where you are in that landscape. But when we find someone objectifying sight, and even, sometimes it's ourselves, but when we find someone objectifying sight, that can be so frustrating when you don't share that sight, right? And it's like, I don't know. It's like, in addition to truth, I mean, speaking personally, I'm strongly motivated by frustration. I mean, that's let me just confess that to people. Like frustration at, well, seeing other things like tribalism, name calling, condescension, arrogance, pomposity, objectification of sight. I don't know. It's just I want people to appreciate the different views, different perspectives can at least be rational, and it's at least open for a considered thinking soul to hold something different. And I don't know, it's like frustration guides me sometimes just as much, if not stronger, than a love for truth and wanting to love the other person. But sometimes frustration, I don't know, it's like I'm so frustrated that this other person is like deeming their position objectively rational and objectively true when there are so many people who disagree, including myself. It's like it's frustration that's guiding me on and like making me want to respond to them and type up my response and like quote unquote refute it, right? I mean, I don't know, what do you think about frustration as a guide oftentimes?
It can be a motivator.
Yeah,
What do you think about what do you think about like frustration as kind of a fuel that in the end you sort of convert that fuel into service? So you think about like how you can take all that energy, all that frustration, and then turn it into like maybe a gift or something like this.
Yeah.
I want to tell you actually. Go ahead. You go first.
Okay. No, I mean it's just like I do think, like, yeah, I mean I didn't really want to say guide. I mean I tried to. I mean like motivation, right? Like, and I think that's what I don't know if it's like explicitly doing it or implicitly doing it, but I don't know. It does kind of turn into service, right? Because the frustration, I mean, that's really what spawns me to make certain, videos and, objections to things. Like I don't feel like other people have leveled the objections that I want to level. So, and that makes me frustrated. So then I make a video leveling those objections so I can at least serve, I don't know, in some sense, serve people with those insights and like make long-winded blog posts. People know my very long-winded blog posts that are usually thorough and long-winded. Some of those are sometimes in some of those it's born out of frustration, and I guess that's sort of turning it into service, right? I mean, like I'm getting like hundreds and sometimes thousands of views on some of these things, which is nice, and that's like serving them, right? But it's like sort of frustration is motivating it to serve in some sense. And okay, I'll turn it over to you because we wanted to say something, but I want to say one last thing in relation to this, and it's just like, maybe it's not exactly, maybe frustration is not exactly the whole story, right? I mean, like, our frustration doesn't come out of nowhere, right? Like, what's the ultimate reason for this frustration? I mean, maybe ultimately, it's like because I see something so wrong when people are objectifying their site, that fuels this frustration. It's like, no, like that. So maybe it's like a site of truth or like a site of something wrong is going on that fuels that frustration. So it's not like frustration in and of itself. It's like not getting mad for mad's sake, but you really want to get to the bottom of that frustration, and perhaps it's ultimately a love for truth and a love for loving and respecting other people that is sort of spawning that frustration when you see such principles violated or you see such tips being like flaunted and like violated and so on. So maybe that's I don't know. I'm just ranting right now, but I'm so passionate about this.
No, that's really good, and I'm just kind of thinking with you about this because I think that what you're bothered by is kind of a clue to maybe the kinds of good things that you have to offer. And I've been thinking about this for myself. Like it seems like you and I we're sort of quantumly entangled in this way that we're sort of bothered by similar things, and we sort of think and process things in a similar way. And so one of the things that I would be bothered by would be the kind of sort of tribal way of thinking about topics. Like, so are you on my team or are you on their team? That sort of thing. That would bother me. And what would bother me actually much even more than that would be if you add a kind of condescension against people who disagree, and also without like a full understanding of their perspective. It's just like, well, you think this, therefore we know who you are. That would just really bother me. And I'm wondering if like what's going on here is that there are some truths that you're seeing, Joe, that are really important truths, and you're bothered when those truths aren't sort of activated in people's lives. And it's actually very valuable for you then to highlight. I almost feel like you're implicitly like modeling some of those truths like through then your work. So your work is like modeling some of these truths, like the value of seeing that actually this argument doesn't render this person irrational because this person could respond in these 6 different ways or 22 ways or whatever it is, you find all these different paths, and then what you're doing is you're actually showing that the original argument wasn't a sort of logic trap. You've actually freed people from the logic trap.
Yes.
And I feel like that's actually a really important service right there. And if frustration gives you the fuel to do that, and then you convert that into love, so you're loving your audience, and it's not just about you, it's about even like setting others free from these logic traps, these arguments. And I've been thinking a lot about even like authorities that don't have insight. So it's like authority not based on understanding, but authority based on maybe just passed on or something, or just based on a position, a sense of like, I have this authority. then those things would bother me a lot. And I would be thinking like, okay, I'm bothered, so maybe I need to let that go. Or instead, this is something I feel like I've been maybe learning recently. I've been thinking like, how do I take all that energy and actually convert it into a positive state without just like ignoring it? I just smashed getting excited here. But
Yeah.
and I want to just share because there was this sort of limiting belief that I had that actually my sister Jenny, who is visiting, she helped me kind of recently kind of work through something, which I think is exactly relevant to these conversations. And the limiting belief that I was having is that if I try to make myself understood, that's selfish because I'm thinking about my own self and I'm working hard for them to see me. And she really turned that around for me. She said, you know what, actually, it's a gift to people that you would share your soul with them, that they would look into you and see you. That's actually honoring to them. And so, and when others are seeking for you to understand them, that's not selfish of them either. That's also a gift to you because it shows that they're honoring you. And I have to say that actually was very liberating for me. It's like, oh, okay, that helps me. That actually helps me so that I can turn maybe a feeling of frustration or feeling kind of bothered that something's not seen, and I can sort of turn this into something that can actually be helpful to people. And it isn't selfish to do that. I think it would be problematic if my method of doing that was to turn around and shame others or to say, oh, you are a fool. Like that's obviously not going to be helpful. But if instead I'm like, okay, well, let me actually go ahead and try to explain this and clarify this, even if it's so that I feel like I'm better understood, like that's okay,
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, no, yeah, I resonate with so much of that. So as is usual on the Majesty of Reason channel, we have to get into at least some like heavy duty philosophy. So
Yeah.
we were gonna, Josh and I were gonna cover maybe, I don't know, 10 minutes or so, who knows, on rational, because we're currently in the section entitled The Nature of Rational Disagreement. And so what comes up in debates concerning rational disagreement is something called the epistemology of disagreement. And it basically concerns, for the audience, basically concerns like what to do when you come across an epistemic peer and what to do when that epistemic peer disagrees with you. So it's useful to define what an epistemic peer is. An epistemic peer is basically someone who they're approximately as intelligent as you are. They are approximately as well informed as you are. They're approximately as biased or unbiased as you are. Approximately, they've had like the same sort of, you know, acquaintance with the literature, or they've read similar kinds of books, similar philosophical acumen, but yet they disagree with you. So they're an epistemic peer, right? They pretty much have the access to the same evidence as you do. They've thought about the same arguments. They've watched some of the same debates, but yet they come to a different conclusion. And they're an epistemic peer of yours. And so, man, it's like, what do you do? And so broadly, there are two different, well, in philosophy, there are billions of different camps, but there are two broad different camps, and it's just useful. I know we're separating people into fences, but it's useful to help the views, explicate them. There are roughly two camps. So there's conciliation, and then there's steadfastness. So conciliation says when you come across a peer disagreement, or perhaps a certain level of peer disagreement, the best thing to do, or what you rationally should do, is really suspend judgment, or at least in some cases, substantially lower your confidence in your position. And maybe one sort of motivation for that is, and Josh, I'll turn it over to you after I get done explicating the views.
Yeah.
So maybe one sort of motivator for that is a sort of symmetry breaker, or sort of arbitrariness, right? So it's just like, if I'm doing a math problem and I get something, and you're doing that same math problem, you get something, like we both know that we're equally competent in math, and we're in the same class, and you get something different than I do. It's just like, we both should probably at least like, it would seem arbitrary for me to just be like, oh no, mine's correct. Why? Because it's me. It's me, right? And it's just like, because you could say the same thing, and it's it's just like a sort of symmetry breaker. It's like, that's not a relevant difference. We need some sort of relevant difference between us, not the mere fact that it's me. Another thing to think of, it's like if you're driving in your car and you have a little thermometer in your car, and it says, well, it's summer now, so it would say like 90, but the big bank over there says 94, and you're like, oh man, maybe should I form a belief that it's 92? Or should I just stick with 90 just because it's mine and it's my car, and we can suppose that you don't have any special reason to trust either one. because they're sort of on par. And that's sort of the epistemic peer thing. So it's a sort of symmetry breaking, sort of arbitrariness that motivates people to go to the conciliation route. And then on the flip side, there's the steadfastness view, which says like, no, upon seeing or coming across a peer that disagrees, or even a certain amount of peers that disagree, the proper epistemic response to that is to remain steadfast, to hold your view. You're not going to at least substantially reduce your confidence. You might like increase or decrease your confidence just a little bit, but yeah, you don't sort of don't just suspend judgment on it. Keep your view, even if there's sort of rational disagreement, or even if there's an epistemic peer that disagrees with you. So I laid out the views, and I wanted to maybe spend maybe like 6 more minutes on this, just to get their gears turning in their minds. So, do you have any particular things that you want to take the discussion from here on out for
the peer disagreement? Well, I'm curious to sort of even see what you think about it. I have a friend, Nathan Ballantyne. He's from Fordham University, and he's done a lot of work on the disagreement literature, and it's very interesting because one of the things that makes this literature kind of interesting or valuable is that you start to like wonder how you can know anything or believe anything or be justified in believing anything when people disagree about everything, especially if you have the conciliatory view where as soon as there's a disagreement and they're a peer, or even like maybe they're above you, maybe they're an expert,
superior,
then it's like, well, it just washes your own belief away, your own justification. And he's got this article called Counterfactual Philosophers.
Yes, like what if David Lewis had survived longer and he attended my conference and he leveled a devastating objection to my paper? Like, had he survived longer? Sorry for interrupting you. I got so excited.
Yeah. So, I mean, he exacerbates the problem because even if you don't actually have any peers, you can still imagine a peer, and the symmetry problem comes back right away because you just imagine a hypothetical peer who knows everything that you know and then still disagrees with you. And as long as that's still even a possibility, as long as there's a possible peer, then why would you prefer your belief over the belief of your possible peer who disagrees with you? So now it's really hard. You can't really get away from peer disagreement. And so, I mean, I would say that, there's a sort of strong motivation to be a conciliatory because of the symmetry problem that you mentioned. But then the practical ramification of that seems to be that you can't believe anything.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I'm curious, like how you think about this? Like, how do you respond to this puzzle?
So, I intend to do a little sneak peek for people. I intend to do some sort of video in the future that's like a lecture on the epistemology of disagreement, because there are so many fun ways to like use the critical thinking tools that I talk about in my book to like apply it to this debate, because it has so many different things like counterfactual like disagreement. There's like circularity comes in, symmetry breakers come in, arbitrariness comes in, self-defeat comes in, self-undermining comes in. It's so exciting. But anyway, yeah. So for me, well, if you want to know my position, I think of it as a spectrum. So you have very strong, steadfast views where it doesn't affect your confidence in any way, shape, or form. Nope. Steadfast, full-blown. Conciliatory is completely a full-blown, strong conciliatory, excuse me. On the spectrum, this is just completely full-blown suspend judgment. Like, nope. And there's a spectrum, right? And so if you're placing me on the spectrum, I'd be close to over here near the steadfast, but I wouldn't be full-blown steadfast. I'd just be maybe slightly off. I do think the pure disagreement might justifiably lower your confidence a little bit, just a little bit. And I think that avoids a bunch of the problems for conciliation, and I don't think it. I think it provides a sort of avenue to preserve epistemic humility in the face of people who are just as competent as you are. But I did want to help navigate certain arguments. So like conciliation, it seems to me, one of the main arguments against it is just that it seems self-defeating, right? Because there's so much peer disagreement on whether or not conciliation is true, right? And so if you take the conciliation thesis, which says like in the face of an epistemic peer who disagrees with you, you ought to suspend judgment on that matter. Well, then let's apply that to conciliation itself, because there are epistemic peers, in fact, probably epistemic superiors, who who disagree about that very position, and hence it would dictate to us that we should even suspend judgment on that position. So it's sort of it shoots itself in the foot. Now, some people say like, okay, well. We don't really have to believe it's true or believe it's correct. We can sort of adopt it as a methodological guide or principle or tool. It's sort of what the verificationists tried to do when they found out that the verification principle was self-defeating. They tried to say it's like a principle, and you don't really have to affirm or believe that it's true. It's sort of like a principle, and like principles by their nature like dictate that they themselves are correct or something. Like it's something like that. But then not only does that seem kind of ad hoc because it's like, okay, well, it applies to everything except for itself, but also like it's it still misses the more fundamental point, which is just that the arguments, it's going to afflict the arguments in favor of conciliation, right? Because those themselves, when you're talking about the premises in conciliation, they're not going to be identical to the conciliation thesis, lest they be question begging. So they're going to be different. You're going to have to like adduce different premises, and it's those specific premises that the steadfast people are going to disagree with, and hence, you're undermining all of the arguments that you could have in favor of conciliation. If this rational disagreement is such that it you have to suspend judgment, that means that there's not going to be any argument in favor of conciliation, because every single argument is such that there's going to be peer disagreement on at least one of those premises, or maybe even all of them. And so, it's completely collapses in on itself. That's what it seems to me. Anyway, I've been talking for so long. Sorry, you go.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. It's interesting because I think I actually have maybe different instincts on this, but I'm looking for synthesis. Everything you said made a lot of sense. I was going to say, I like how you put the sort of the spectrum of being conciliatory versus being steadfast. And I think the same thing with being a peer. There's sort of like a spectrum of like you could be closer and closer to being a peer, and so you could sort of think about that. But I was like thinking of maybe of a toy example where, let's say that you and I are looking at a wall together, and the wall just looks red to you, and then it looks blue to me. Okay, and this is sort of like the dress, I guess. Remember the dress where it's like gold? Yeah. But let's say we're looking at a wall and it looks red to you and looks blue to me. So you tell me how it looks to you. It looks red, and then I say, oh no, it actually looks blue. And let's say you're convinced that I'm completely a peer. Like I have your same, like even atom for atom. Like my brain is the same. Let's imagine I'm completely a peer. My history is the same. All my experiences are the same. Everything's the same. What would you think, like in that case? Like, would you just think, like, what color do you think the wall would be? Would you just
I really like this, and it helps get into the nuance of the views. So I would actually nuance my view further to accommodate different things like perceptual cases, and cases where the disagreement is much more symmetrical in such a case. And so that's where you get different views cropping up that are like distinctive, that don't really fit that dichotomous steadfastness versus conciliatory. And so, yeah, in that case, I probably have to think about it further. I mean, usually when I'm thinking about these debates, I'm trying to get to the underlying principle, right? So, I mean, when we get to these certain cases, there might be intuitive seemings.
Well, here's the underlying, and you and I think similarly. Like it's the principles that seem clearer and even more exciting to our minds. So, the principle I want to propose, it's going to sound really counterintuitive, but I need an intuitive example to save myself. Okay, it's that pairhood is actually very rare.
That's it. Yes.
Yeah. And that even and that even in the arguments for the conciliatory, the people making those arguments can just say, oh yeah, we don't have peers. And I know, like, it sounds arrogant, right? So that's like the problem. Like you can't make that argument because it sounds arrogant to say, oh, we don't have peers. But the idea here is like in the wall case, my thought is that probably we would both be like, I don't know what's going on. Like I can't trust my senses more than your senses, because we actually believe that we're peers in that case. But there's this weird thing that happens where your very reasons for thinking that something is true could then be turned into reasons for thinking that other people aren't peers, even if they have the same education, the same background. And it's tricky because it can almost be offensive. It's like, well, I mean, who am I to say that like I know more than them or whatever, So that's sort of the challenge there.
No, I got so excited because in my initial presentation, right when I turned it over to you, I was like, crap, I forgot to mention something that I really wanted to mention. And it was actually the very notion. I wanted to get into the notion of an epistemic peer. And I was actually going to say, I mean, it sounds unbelievable when you already said it, but I was going to say very, very close to what you're actually saying. I was going to say, it's actually not even clear to me, like if there are, I don't know, are there epistemic peers?
Well, this is where I was thinking actually, because at first I said it seems like maybe my instinct is different, but then I thought actually I'm looking for synthesis because there's a way of defining peer so that it's maybe it has a loose requirement so that it's easier to have peers, in which case steadfastness would make sense. Mm-hmm. Why would it make sense? Because there are symmetry breakers in the epistemic situation, as long as the epistemic situation isn't fully baked into peerhood. So there's like strict peerhood and then like loose peerhood, and then you'll get different views of whether you should be steadfast or conciliatory based on your definition of peer.
Exactly.
And this can resolve the disagreement between the people who are talking about different theories of pure disagreement. Just beautiful and interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we're gonna move on, but I did just want to say, like, lastly, like, um, what really motivates me to, like, um, so when I was saying, like, when I lean towards this sort of steadfast view, I'm kind of going with, like, what people in the literature are calling, like, peers, which is kind of this broad notion where it's like roughly they're always, almost always, you'll see in the literature it's approximately the same books, approximately the same, because no one has that exact identity, right? Like, exactly the same books, exactly the same debates, and so on. And so we really kind of have to say this approximate. So when we're defining peer more broadly like that, then I lean towards a sort of steadfast view. But
Mhm.
when we're defining it the other way, then I start to think that, well, I'm not even sure if there are peers. And the reason is precisely because what we've been talking about this whole entire time, that everyone occupies their unique position on the epistemological landscape. There are no two, like, identical positions for the most
Mhm.
part on the epistemological landscape. Like, I have this privileged access to my set of experiences in life that are so unique to me and so unique to my priors and my in this interlocking web of priors and beliefs and experiences and arguments and debates that I've watched and so on. And that whole interlocking web is such that I don't even know what a peer with me would look like apart from me. I don't know. That's
Yeah.
really that's
Yeah,
really
and it
what
can come in degrees, I think.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we've covered peer disagreement. That was for our philosophy. That was our philosophy bit
Yeah.
that I really wanted to get to. So the next one was that, okay, so this one maybe we can this one is going to be a little bit shorter. Extra rational barriers to belief that we want to talk about.
Mm.
So the main thing that I wanted to we already talked about psychological determinants of belief, which I was something that I wanted to get at in this section. But since we've already sort of covered that, I do want to talk about certainty and confidence. Because it's like, this is not necessarily an irrational barrier to believing something, but it's sort of extra rational. It's like when you see so many people in this camp, as it were, or in this group, and you see this sort of certainty that just, like, is, like, bleeding through the entire camp, right? It's almost as though, I don't know, some people might be drawn to that. Other people are drawn so far away from that. They think that that's, like, I don't know.
Mhm.
It's like they think that that's a sign of, like, well, maybe a sort of condescension or something. Other people are drawn to it because it's like a confidence or something. But, like, these are sort of extra rational. Like, I don't know. There could be a case to be made,
Mhm.
like, that it might be natural to sort of be drawn to that, or it might be, like, natural to be like, that is frustrating. That gets me very angry. And I don't know. What do you think about, like, certainty and confidence and these sort of extra rational influences on our acceptance of things?
Yeah, I think people have different personalities that draw them to different things. Like, so I think I would tend to be drawn to maybe the more fundamental principles. I'm always looking for the fundamental principle more so than the concrete examples. And I've noticed, I think, like, a lot of people are more kind of drawn towards concrete examples, maybe more so than the principles. Or, as you were saying, like, some people may be more drawn towards seeing if they can sort of achieve a certainty about something. And maybe others are maybe more repelled by the achieving of certainty because that would be sort of a sign of closing yourself off to further understanding. And so, yeah, I think you have these different personalities, and then you could say these are extra rational, or it's not like it's a mark of rationality that you are maybe drawn towards principles versus
Hmm.
drawn towards concrete examples or something, or drawn towards certainty versus drawn towards resisting certainty, because I could see how people could use all of those,
Hmm.
um, to get to truth and to use all of those rationally. So yeah, I'm not really sure what to think about it, except that, I this is something that you've suggested to me really through an email, which is that if different people have their different tendencies, maybe their different strengths, and if other people with different strengths sort of saw that all the different strengths could work together, then everybody could sort of lean on each other's strengths. So, for example, I'm going to use the principles versus concrete examples as my example. Um, I tend towards principles, and so it will be helpful for me to have a conversation with somebody who can maybe test my principles with concrete examples, and then that can help sort of clarify, for them, like, if they actually hold up. And then it's helpful for me if I can take their examples and see, okay, but is that a principled, is that sort of ad hoc, or is there actually a deeper principled explanation of that? And that's why, like, I would talk a lot about irrelevant differences. Like, that would sort of show up in my work because it's like, well, I'm looking for the deepest principles that provide the relevant differences, and not just on the level of, like, this is a coffee mug and that's a turtle, but, like, this is, this has limits, or whatever it is,
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
whatever
yeah.
I think that it might be. I'm trying to look for the most general principle. And then that makes it so abstract that, maybe it's vulnerable to counterexample and maybe even hard to think about. So that's why, I don't know, I guess it just seems like it is helpful to have all eyes sort of working together and bringing all the strengths together rather than sort of cutting it off and saying, okay, this way is the way to truth. It has to be based on principles, or it has to be based on stories, or it has to be based on certainties. Like, well, no.
Let sight blossom.
Yeah. It's a nice
Yeah.
phrase.
Let's see. Okay, the last thing I sort of want to get at in this extra rational barrier to belief thing was, I don't know, just to talk about mine, because people probably can tell, like, from what if I put in like blog posts and what I say on this, it's like I sort of lean against, or I guess lean away from that sort of certainty thing, right? So I don't know. Speaking personally, like, I don't know, even if I think up a sort of new argument for or against some position, and it seems very forceful to my mind, like, I don't know, there's still this nagging portion of my mind that's like, well, there's always the possibility that there's some devastating objection that I haven't encountered, right? Or that, will be thought up later, or someone will raise later, right? It's like, it's hard to get myself to be, utterly confidently express a sure and firm affirmation of an argument's force, for instance. I'm like, I can defend it, and I can defend it with like rigorous, precise, systematic argumentation, but at the end of the day, there's still like that's some sort of like pull, right? Like some fear, fear, like that I've gotten something wrong along the way. I don't know. This kind of deals even with the psychological influences on belief, and I don't know. It's like, how do I know that someone in a couple years won't have a decisive response to this argument? How can I be confident that I haven't because I haven't read all of the literature? How can I be confident that a decisive response to what I'm saying isn't even found in some sort of footnote to some sort of book that's on something else? Because that's happened to me. It's happened different times, and it's like I don't know. It's like I see that I don't see everything, right? And it's like that sight in our email exchange, I put it as like a higher order sight of all the sites. It's like I see on this higher order level, I see that I don't have all the sites, right? I see that there are darkened places, darkened as it were, that I haven't seen yet, and I know that other people like might potentially see those, or might even see those categorically. I don't know. That's kind of my personality, and I just wanted to share that with you if you had any thoughts of that.
It's there's a kind of a humility there, recognizing that you don't see everything. The other thing I'm kind of hearing you express is maybe there could even be a little bit of a fear there. Like there's sort of a fear that you haven't figured it out or something. And I actually wonder if some of that could, okay, and I'm doing a psychoanalysis or whatever, and I'm not trying to psychoanalyze you, but I'm thinking about a certain type or certain category where there can be almost like a authority structure that's trying to protect something, and they'll protect that something by always like making it so that nobody could sort of rationally not believe that something. And this is something that actually kind of bothers me, and I think about this, that there can be an authority structure that can actually cause people a fear and a feeling of uncertainty about their own rejection of that authority structure, because that authority structure always has its answers forever. And it's like, I just like want to smash that thing and just like liberate all the people from those things and just say, look, no, like look inside, like trust that inner light, like you're doing a good job. Like, I don't know if that makes sense. Like, I really feel that a lot. It's like, I don't want you to feel afraid. Like, I want you to feel more just like curious, and like the fact that, and you do, I mean, you that's the dominant feeling that I get from you, is that feeling of curiosity. And even the fact that there's more to see, that's actually a reason for excitement, because yes, there's more to see.
Yeah.
And so, and I definitely see that. But there's can also be this other thing where I've experienced this, where it's like, I've definitely experienced this, where it's like there are certain things I've worked myself out of those beliefs, but it's almost actually feels like, oh, danger, or like there's a yellow flag there, like you have to be careful, like this is dangerous territory. And it's like, where is that? What's doing that? Like what's causing that? And I think that there's maybe lots of reasons that could cause that, but sometimes it's because other people have called that position or lack of position dangerous.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to go on there, but we could probably go to the fourth topic that I wanted to cover. And that's intellectual virtues, and maybe like neglected intellectual virtues, something like that. So I know before we went live, I was talking about how intellectual responsibility is kind of like one of these, perhaps somewhat neglected, intellectual virtues that is really good to cultivate. And so intellectual responsibility, I actually defined it in my book. How about you pick? I'll find the definition, and how about you pick one apart from intellectual responsibility, also called epistemic responsibility. How about you pick one that's somewhat neglected, maybe you think, but that's also super important while I try to
Uh-huh.
find this definition.
I was going to say humility, but I don't know if that's
Well,
neglected.
you can. I mean, you can pick it if you want.
Yeah. I don't know. I think for me, yeah, go ahead. You ready?
No, yeah. But intellectual perseverance, that's another
Yeah.
one that I okay.
Oh,
But
yeah.
intellectual responsibility, this is how I talked about it in my book. So I said developing intellectual responsibility is a matter of taking charge. It's okay. Let me emphasize that. It's a matter of taking charge of
Hmm.
your pursuit of truth, right? Intellectually responsible individuals try to minimize deferring their beliefs to the hands of authority figures. Instead, they seek to equip themselves with justification, arguments, evidence, and reasons. Um, yeah, so that I don't know. It's like it's all about taking hold of your own pursuit of truth and not sort of deferring it for the thinking of others. And of course, we can't do that in everything, right? Like I don't do the weather forecasts, and
Hmm.
I defer that to the weather person, right? But I don't know. What do you think about that? And maybe what is something else you were going to go on? So I'll give you the
Yeah. Well, no, this might be even sort of the most important thing of all of the things that we've talked about so far. Is just taking responsibility to own your own understanding. And like it does like come down to decision. Like, okay, I'm going to actually take responsibility to see things, to understand things. And I think that is the decision of an ideal leader, somebody who has first-hand understanding so they can see it for themselves. It doesn't mean that they always get everything right. There's risk in that. But it just means that even when there's authorities that are helping you, you think of those authorities, those experts, as kind of almost like your servants rather than as your masters, if that
hmm
makes sense. They're not masters over your mind. I think actually this would be helpful sort of in current events when people are trying to make sense of like what's going on in current events and there's like different authorities and experts saying different things. And if you could just sort of see all of them as your servants, and especially when they're different competing experts, it's like, well, if they're your servants rather than your masters, then you still have the ultimate responsibility to sort of figure out if they're trustworthy or like if they actually have knowledge or insight, and it's not that you have to become an expert, it's just that you are still ultimately responsible. You can't like blame them. You can't just say like, oh well, they misled me. I mean, I guess you could blame them, right? But ultimately you're the one responsible for sort of figuring out who you're going to trust, who you're going to look to for information, and really to own that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I did have one more, the intellectual perseverance. This is another one that's sort of
Yeah.
neglected. Um, and of course, intellectual empathy is another one, just like really understanding, like it's all about like the seeing that person, like recognizing the rational, that intellectual empathy. It's like being able to
Hmm.
enter into their intellectual side as well. But this intellectual perseverance, um, so basically intellectual perseverance is it's a committed rejection of intellectual laziness. So those with intellectual perseverance see barriers, hardships, and obstacles in their intellectual life as challenges to be overcome and opportunities for growth, right? Instead of giving up their pursuit of truth when it gets tough, right? They dig even deeper into the issues. They read and investigate further, and they grow in knowledge and understanding. And problems and puzzles are opportunities for discovery, right? Not insurmountable barriers. It's really all about persisting in the path of discovery, because treasures ultimately await you, right? Um,
Hmm.
and so I don't know. It's all about persistence. I mean, and this is something that also drives some of my frustration. It's like whether it's an atheist or a theist, right? The theist, some people like that I know just like personally in like real life, like you hear one debate or something, or you hear one argument, you hear one presentation of the Kalam,
Hmm.
and they're like, okay, God exists. Like it's demonstrated, it's just like, and that's it. And they just don't like pursue further. It's like, well, let me look. There's this huge philosophical literature that's talking about
Hmm.
objections, and I don't know. It's like if you want to say justifiably that it's been, like the debate is over on something. It's just like you have to intellectually persevere this. You have to keep
Hmm.
going, right? I mean, like you can't watch one debate and say that it's settled. I don't know. It's like,
Hmm.
and this happens on all
Objectively
sides.
settled, right?
Exactly.
Not just settled from my own perspective.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I hear you.
And it happens on
Yeah.
all sides. I don't,
Yeah.
so we'll turn over to the fifth part of this thing after I get your final thoughts on intellectual perseverance.
Yeah, I think that's really important. You're reminding me of something that is related to kind of which truths you seek, or like which truths you consider to be important. And I almost wonder if like there are certain truths. I'm gonna put my finger here to signify, like, let's say there's a question about whether something's true, and then there's like this debate that goes around that question, and that debate can get very complex, like maybe even infinitely complex. And maybe it's almost like you're learning a lot of things in the process of that debate, like you're seeing other things in the process of that debate. But some of those other things, so let me get this concrete. Let's say this is the question of whether God exists. And let's say that one of the things that somebody comes to really see is the value of truth. Okay. And they come to see that. And they also come to see the value of these tools that you're describing as a means to getting truth about this question. So they've picked up this sight of the value of truth on their way to trying to understand the answer to this question. Meanwhile, there's somebody else over here who has the value of truth as the thing that they're debating. And there's a whole circle of debates that, you know, that they're thinking about, like, what is truth? Does truth exist? Right? Because there's this whole truth literature. What is value? Does anything have value? You know, you could be a value nihilist, you know, and could you imagine like somebody over here who's very interested in this debate over the value of truth? They look at somebody over here who just seems to pick up the value of truth with one argument and run with it, right? And it's almost like, and I'm using that as an example because it's one where I think you and I both like see the value of truth, and we haven't really been spending that much time going through all the arguments for and against the value of truth.
That was one of the criticisms. So okay, so I sorry to interject, but that okay, so there are like maybe like 5 reviews or 6 reviews on Amazon, and one of the persons, his review was excellent, or his or her review, I forget the name, was excellent. It was wonderful, and they had one criticism, and it was like, although the book is really good, he kind of just assumed the value of truth, and like he probably should have dedicated like a more argument as to why we should like actually value truth and value this philosophical dialogue. I'm like, okay, yeah, you're right. Like, point taken. Like, that actually is correct. That's a good criticism of my book. So it's like, it is something that I glossed over. Like, you and I, we're talking about, we don't spend too much time on that. But go on. I just really
want to well, and I mean, you're taking the criticism very well, you know, but I mean, I almost want to even just like affirm that because there are infinitely many propositions and you can't like debate all of them, it's almost like you have to kind of have some focus, you know, and I've actually just been like wondering about this, like if certain propositions sort of organize certain conversations, and then you develop almost like these virtues and the deeper things, even like love for people in the context of those conversations around those propositions, and then other people are circling around a different proposition, taking for granted maybe things over here, but they're developing the same virtues in the other context. And almost like maybe even the more important thing, even then getting to truth, right, as important as that is developing some of these personal, interpersonal virtues and just like loving people, which isn't to in any way put truth as not having value, but it's almost like to put it into the context of like maybe even a higher value. And it's all cyclical, because then when you're in rapport, then more truth gets seen, so it's never a competition there. But I've just like really thought about that. I've been wondering about that, like how it'll strike me like, wow, I mean, there are questions over here that it feels like, yeah, there's all these arguments, like who can even know what's true here, especially without going through all the arguments, or if you did have a rational belief, like you have to at least read 20 books or you're not even entitled to have a rational belief on this, right? There's that sort of that feeling. And then there are these other contexts where it's like, they're not even thinking about any of that. Like that, they just have beliefs, but then they're really intensely thinking about something else that like I'm not thinking about. You know what I mean?
Yeah, perspective taking. You're helping me perspective take. Like that's good. Yeah, I like that. I don't have much more to say, but like that is cool. Like to reflect on, like, yeah, I mean, there are all these like I sort of settled on the value of truth, and then I'm pursuing this other thing upon that assumption. But then other people,
and I don't necessarily want you getting distracted and spending like a career trying to figure out, does truth have value? Like, I'm excited that you see the value of truth, and like that's good for me. Like, I want you to.
There are arguments. I mean, I think they're good because it's like even the nihilist who's, it's almost like a self-defeating thing, because even the nihilists that like even engaging in these conversations, they're seeing some value of truth and doing that, and it's almost like
just translate that in terms of their desire and. it's not really detecting value, right? I mean, there's always replies, Joe, right?
And there's modal uniformity, because now if you're casting doubt
Yeah.
on this site, then you're going to start to cast doubt on your
Oh,
other.
that's good. I
Okay.
like that.
Anyway,
That's a good one.
anyway, putting
Yeah.
all that aside,
Yeah.
let's get into our fifth, because we're at 1 hour and 40 minutes. So I don't know, maybe like 10 more minutes or something if you're
Sounds
cool
good.
with that, something like that. And this last one is the tension between maximizing true beliefs and minimizing false beliefs. And so for the audience, there's some context to this. So I don't know, it's sort of like it's like if there were a philosopher's motto, I don't know what it would. Maybe it would be something like maximize true beliefs, minimize false beliefs. But I mean, that would have some counterexamples, because, you know, like maximizing true beliefs, I could go out and count the blades of grass. This is one example you gave in one of our conversations with Micah. It's like you can maximize true beliefs by like counting the blades of grass and like so I don't know, maybe maximize, I don't know, beautiful. No, I don't know. Okay, but anyway, something like maximize true beliefs and minimize false beliefs is like the duty of the philosopher. And so it's really interesting to think about how these two actually come into tension with each other. And that can create some hesitance and some caution among thinkers, including myself. So one way to think of this is like along the lines of guilt, innocence, and punishment. Okay, so like we have to ask ourselves, would we rather have a presumption of innocence or a presumption of guilt for our justice system? A presumption of innocence, right, means that more guilty people will end up free without punishment than innocent people will end up punished, right? And then by contrast, a presumption of guilt means that more innocent people will end up punished, but less guilty people will end up free, right? This points to a sort of potential divide, namely a presumption in favor of maximizing true beliefs versus a presumption in favor of minimizing false beliefs. And, you know, I don't know, it's because like when you try to maximize your true beliefs, whatever you're doing, like just as we as a society have to weigh whether we want more innocent people punished or more guilty people to roam free, like we as seekers of truth, we have to weigh whether we want more false beliefs, which is like that's a probable concomitant, right, of trying to maximize truth. Because if you're trying to maximize truth, like you're kind of being risky. You're trying to gain as many true beliefs as you can, but in that process, you're kind of increasing your risk. You're like risk taking. Like you're gonna get some false beliefs in there, right? Like the more you try to expand your belief system, you know, all else being equal, you're going to be probably increasing your false beliefs, versus if you want to have a presumption of minimizing false beliefs, which would like actually limit, sometimes it might limit you gaining more truths that you would otherwise have had you been more risky, right? I'm probably explaining this horribly, but I'll turn it over to you, Josh. What do you think about that, and how do we navigate this tension, right? Because both of these are so valuable. Like I want more truths, but I want to minimize my false beliefs. It's like I value truth so much that I hate false beliefs. I don't want these false beliefs. It's like I want to minimize those so much. I actually kind of put preference on that. I know I told you this in an email. I kind of put preference in this tension on minimizing false beliefs, and that might limit me. Yeah, avoiding error, and that might limit me sometimes. And that kind of goes into this, you know, the certainty versus uncertainty. It kind of goes into all that. Anyway, we're all this is going full circle. But I'll turn it over to you. What do you think about this?
Well, it even goes to like, what is the value of a true belief? You know, like why do you want true beliefs? You know, and as you began, you talked about the difference between like having true beliefs about grass. Like I can get a lot of true beliefs if I really want to maximize true beliefs and avoid false beliefs. I can just go count the blades of grass in my yard and just say, okay, here's one blade of grass here. That's a true belief. Here's another blade of grass here. Another true belief. Wow, this is great. You know, I come back in, Rachel, I'm back from work. What'd you do, you know, in your job today? Well, I'm a philosopher. You know, I got a lot more true beliefs today. You know, I did my work for the day and it's great. But it's like, it's not very helpful. It's not going to serve my family. It's not going to serve me. And so I've been thinking really a lot about what truths really matter the most.
Yeah.
You know, and maybe it's just a matter of like making truth a priority and at the same time making truths that are treasures a priority, as in truths that will serve people. And that means like paying attention to what people, what would help people. Now, there's a little bit of a trickiness here because it's not that you find out, well, John would be helped if they believed, if John believed that this were true, then John would be helped. So now I'm going to go marshal all this evidence to show that that's true or something. No, it's not about that. It's more that here are maybe some general questions people are asking. They're trying to get understanding about this. And it could be practical, like how to manage your money, how to manage relationships, how to have productive conversations, how to get more truth, right? You know, these questions. And so then you start thinking about those questions. as a way to get more insight to answering those questions. And I do think that it takes a certain work to get to truth, and it takes certain courage to get to truth about anything. And that you kind of have to be careful, because nobody wants to be taken in, and nobody wants to be called gullible. Nobody wants to believe a lie, and one way you can keep yourself from ever believing a lie, it's like if you're afraid of getting into a relationship because you don't want your heart to be broken. It's like in the same way, like you're afraid to arrive at certain conclusions or something. Although it's tricky because you can't really just choose directly your beliefs. So it's not so much about like being afraid to form a belief, but maybe it's like, I made this video once where you might remember this, Joe. I imagine you watching this video because I think you commented on it, where I talked about like the truth seeker having two instruments. One was to build an argument, and then one was to like test it. Do you remember that? Do you have like a picture of that?
You're talking about how it's much harder. It's much easier to try to destroy an argument versus constructing like this whole worldview, right?
Yeah, and you can actually decide to do both. Where construction doesn't mean you're constructing beliefs. It means that you're coming up with maybe toy hypotheses to see if you can explain a set of data, or you're coming up with a new argument to see if you can find a pathway to a conclusion. You're doing that, and at the same time, you're coming in with the instrument of trying to destroy it. So it's sort of the project of building and the project of destroying. And maybe that's a helpful way to put it, because I don't see that you can like directly choose to have a belief. I think you more indirectly get beliefs through a certain kind of inquiry, but you can directly choose to try to construct a model or try to construct an objection. And like those are different projects, and if you sort of find yourself like always only debunking arguments over here, it's like, well, there's value in that, but it can also be valuable to then also, come up with your own system.
Yeah. No, I really like that distinction. It's so helpful. I guess another way to help the audience see why these, I guess the maximizing true beliefs and minimizing false beliefs, why these actually are sort of in tension with one another, is to think of the extremes, right? So someone who is only dedicated to minimizing false beliefs simply won't believe anything. They won't believe it. It'll sort of be like the radical skeptic. Like they take minimizing false beliefs so far as to have zero false beliefs by means of not believing anything. And so that's a sort of extreme. But that's actually incompatible, clearly, with the extreme of trying to maximize true beliefs, because if you believe absolutely everything, including things like P and not P, right? If you believe both of them, one of them's true. So you will actually end up believing every single true proposition if you believe everything. If you say, if you have this doxastic attitude of I believe everything, you will end up believing every single truth. But you also end up believing the negation of every single truth. So it's like these two things are incompatible. and like, where do we go? Like, there's this tension between them. There's this full-blown minimizing false beliefs. There's this full-blown maximizing true beliefs. Where do we go? I mean, man, and there's this tension between them, because the more you maximize your true beliefs, you're sticking your neck out. You're risking getting more false beliefs because you're trying to accrue more of these true beliefs, and you're trying to build this whole system. But then the more you try to minimize false beliefs, you're kind of shaving off more, because you're like, that might be wrong. I want to minimize it. Anyway, you can see the struggles of my heart just coming out in this video.
Well, I like how you go to the extremes. That is also a tool for getting to truth. It's like taking things all the way out to the extreme. And this is kind of a good way of thinking about it. It's like, okay, let's take it all the way to the extreme. Let's say you maximize true beliefs. You just believe everything. Okay, then you believe all the false things too, right? Or you just believe nothing. So then you can ask, like, well, which is sort of like the worst state of mind, to believe all falsehoods and all truths, or to believe nothing? I don't know. That's like, I can't even think about that.
Oh man, would you rather? That's a good would you rather for philosophers. That's a good would you rather. I'm gonna be honest. Like, if I were presented with that, I would probably minimize. I think I wouldn't believe anything if I had to choose between those two. But people will diverge on that.
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know actually what I would do. That's interesting. Because if I didn't believe anything, I wouldn't even believe, that my wife is real. But then, of course, if I believed everything, I would also believe she's not real, right? That's
yeah. Oh man, it's just okay. Well, anyway, that was such a fun conversation. We're at about 1:49, so we covered, I just want to do a little summary for the audience, just so it's really nice to do the recap. So we covered productive and loving dialogue across ideological barriers, right? We talked about insight flow. We talked about like 22 tips for the exchange of ideas, and those were from my book. We talked about strategies for de-escalation, both on like Facebook and real life. We also talked in the next section on the nature of rational disagreement. So we talked about arguments as sort of confessions, like I just confessed to you. We talked about the objectivity of sight versus the subjectivity of sight. We discussed frustration as a sort of motivator in discussing arguments, and even we delved into into the philosophy of conciliation versus steadfastness in the epistemology of disagreement literature, and that was really fun. And then we also, in the third section, we talked about extra rational barriers to belief. So we talked about certainty and confidence, and sometimes like even fear kind of creeps in, that you fear that you got something wrong, or you fear that maybe in 2 years someone will come up with a devastating objection. And we talk about how you can recognize that you haven't seen everything on the epistemological landscape. And then in the fourth section, we talked about some of the neglected intellectual virtues, or because the ones that not much attention is paid to. So we mainly talked about intellectual responsibility and intellectual perseverance, and those two were intellectual empathy, of course, as well, and then intellectual humility was pervading the conversation. So we focus on the intellectual virtues, try to maybe how to cultivate them, and things like that, their value. And then finally, in the fifth section, we talked about the tension between maximizing true beliefs and minimizing false beliefs, and just how to navigate that, and the distinction between building up a worldview and tearing down things. And anyway, so I'll let you get the last remark in before we sign out. So I'll let you go for last.
Yeah, well, thank you. This has been a lot of fun, and I think sort of my summary thought would just be that everything that we're talking about comes down to sort of tools to make you more powerful as a truth seeker. And it actually just takes work to sort of think about, how can I be better at being a truth seeker? I think a lot of times we sort of go out into the wilderness and we seek truth, but we don't take time to think about, how can I improve my powers at getting to truth? And so when we're looking at all these sort of techniques and strategies and the intellectual virtues and all of these different things, this is one of those things that, I don't know, I mean, when I really think about it, like even philosophers, like when we're talking about all these philosophical topics, we'll talk about epistemology, which is like theories of justification, but we won't often talk about, okay, practically, like, how do we actually improve our game? Like, how do we actually get better at this? And so I feel like this is a really important video, Joe, and I feel like this is one that really philosophers, both students of philosophy and professional philosophers, I think, would benefit from watching this video and getting your book. That's what I think. So.
That's funny. Yeah, I mean, I really like talking about this, like the tangible, concrete strategies and the tips, the concrete tips that you can do to actually try to implement these things. Like, you can stay in this land of abstract and principles, and this is what justification is. It's externalist, internalist, no, like proper functionalism, like, but you can also talk about like the concrete, tangible tips that you can do to like maximize your true beliefs and minimize your false beliefs, and all these different strategies for developing these virtues, and insight flow. I don't know. I really like that distinction you just made between like the concrete strategies.
Yeah. We almost like miss that, or we skip that, or we just, we don't take the time to sort of think about like how to actually do that. And it does make a difference. And if I could just add one more kind of final thing here, is I was actually thinking about the sort of rules that the philosophers would tend to follow through the peer review process. So in order to get things published through critical review, I think what has happened is there's these rules of the play that have emerged that make you actually more successful at getting to truth and clearly presenting truth to others. So truth flow or insight flow. Or even if you don't have a true belief, then hopefully you at least have some understanding of something, even if it's false ultimately, and it's flowing from mind to mind. So like, how do you actually do that? And what I've noticed is that there are some of these rules in play, all the ones that you mentioned, and even just rules of like, when you talk with somebody, you don't just say things that you believe that they will believe to be false, because that's actually not helpful. You won't announce something that you already believe that they think is false. And that's why philosophers will often say like, well, it seems to me that, because that's a way of saying something that even your interlocutor will agree that it seems to you that, and so I've like discovered there's all these kind of rules, and they're not common. They're not common in the public sphere, but these are the rules that philosophers use. And I feel like what you've done here is you've brought into the view more than just a small sample of rules to go by. And so anyway, it's just really worth thinking about. It's worth me thinking more about too, because it's like anybody who wants to become a philosopher or wants to get more truth about things, it really does make all the difference. If I just have to say one more thing. I know this is like my final thing, but it's like I was actually telling Rachel the other day, I was like, I would much rather somebody not have any professional training in philosophy, but have some of these principles that we're talking about here, than somebody who has professional training and has an advanced degree and doesn't have these principles.
Yeah.
Because the person with the principles is going to gain way more understanding. And I feel like, I mean, and I just mean this most sincerely, like, and I'm not just like trying to be too nice to you. It's like, you know, like, it's like, I feel like you've come to an understanding of different topics that seem to have such wisdom when you talk about the philosophy of science, or even now when you talked about the conciliatory debate, and you would have such a detailed understanding, and like so quickly. And it feels like even more than maybe people that I would meet who would have more training in the field. It's like, and I feel like part of what's going on there is that you're using these tools that you're talking about, and they're making a difference in your own understanding of things. So, okay, that's my speech.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This is gonna go down in like the archives of one of the greatest conversations on Majesty of Reason. That was so fun. You brought so many wonderful insights and so many different values to this world. So thank you so much for your work, your influence. You're influencing personally like thousands of people, and for so much the better, it's bringing so much value to the world. So
I appreciate
thank you so much, and everyone. I don't even know what to say to finish it other than this is the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and peace out.